Recently, I've been playing through Fire Emblem for the Game Boy Advance, and I've realized one thing. It's an amazing game that still holds up today. Well, how can it not be? It was the first Fire Emblem game to be released outside of Japan and win everyone over. This game was just one of the many factors that played into making Fire Emblem a big name for gaming. But how did Fire Emblem 7 become so good? What was the development of this game like? How did it get localized overseas? What were some of the impacts that this game had on the Fire Emblem series? Well, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls and gold knights, today I hope to answer all of those questions. Welcome to History of the Emblem. Unbeknownst to players overseas, Blazing Blade was a prequel to the previous entry in the Fire Emblem series, which was called Binding Blade. Production for Blazing Blade began as soon as Binding was released and was intended to take 7 months. However, this did not go as planned, as developers found a slew of new features to add. One of these features that may have prolonged development were the CGs, or computer-generated images, that show several times throughout the story. The developers really went all out with how many CGs they included in Blazing Blade, so much so that they were still adding and perfecting the CGs almost 3 months before the game's Japanese release. A build of the game dated as such shows that some of these images, mostly having to do with Hector, were still depicted as black and white sketches. Speaking of Hector, both he and Elowood were some of the characters from Binding Blade to return in Blazing Blade as their younger selves. The other main character, Lyn, was a character that had previously not been seen. Lyn and her accompanying story mode were created to help the game have a steady difficulty increase while still maintaining a well-paced story. In an interview at the game's release, Ryuichiro Koguchi, the game's coordinator, had this to say: "When first planning, I intended to make the game have difficulty in 3 pieces. I intended to have a scenario where the hero is different depending on the difficulty of easy, normal, and hard. But I did not want to call it easy, normal, and hard, so I tried to have the difficulty change as the story progresses, and shifted the story's focus between the 3 main lords, Lyn, Elowood, and Hector. It all got together in the end and became the game we have now." And now that we're on the topic of the game's difficulty, let's take a little tour into the localization of Fire Emblem 7. Before Blazing Blade, Nintendo had repeatedly expressed interest in bringing Fire Emblem games overseas, but constantly cancelled their plans. There was no guarantee that a strategy RPG would ever work, so why bother? However, it was the inclusion of Marth and Roy in Super Smash Bros. Melee that sparked the interest of Fire Emblem in overseas fans. Once players understood that Marth and Roy were from a series that had never been released outside of Japan, they looked away for any way that they could play it, thus creating a small community of fans who wanted to see these games localized. Nintendo's tested the strategy RPG waters with their overseas audience with Advance Wars in 2001, and it did surprisingly well. Now that they knew that fans were willing to play and enjoy a game like this, Fire Emblem Blazing Blade was officially greenlit for an overseas release. Since Nintendo knew that Blazing Blade would reach a wider audience, they played with the game's difficulty and made it more suitable for newcomers. The best thing about the game is that people who have never done simulations can enjoy it enough. I think this was also present in the previous title, Binding Blade, but we do have a desire to change the image of simulation genre that's difficult to stick. Because it is on the Game Boy Advance, we were aiming for the player to be able to enjoy compactly without it becoming too difficult, and still have a deep story. Fire Emblem 7 drew a number of influences from past Fire Emblem games. Of course, it continued the grid-based maps and turn-based combat, but many more of Blazing Blade's features were influenced from past Fire Emblem games. Of course, Fire Emblem Blazing Blade was the second game to use the engine of Binding Blade, so a lot of sound effects, HUD elements, and stylistic choices were reused from the previously mentioned game. Blazing Blade also took Binding Blade's support system of 3 different ranks and various factors determining support bonus. It was the second game in this series to have fully fledged A, B, and C support conversations. Blazing Blade also took part in including some of the pre-existing character archetypes, which are basically different characters that appear over the course of the Fire Emblem series that play the same role. Notable archetypes in Fire Emblem 7 include the Cain and Abel archetype with Sane and Kent, the Pegasus Trio archetype with Florina, Fiora, and Farina, and the Est archetype with Nino.
Do my best!
Fire Emblem 7 has also had a number of influences on the series as well. Some of the smaller changes include things like weather effects in the support viewer, but the biggest feature that stemmed from Blazing Blade was that of the Tactician. This was the first game where players could feel like they were a part of the story, as the game prompts you to input your name, gender, and birth date. This feature would go on to be an inspiration for Chris in New Mystery of the Emblem, Robin in Awakening, Corrin in Fates, and Kieran in Heroes. And since Fire Emblem 7 was the very first game in the series to be released outside of Japan, it set a standard for future localizations. The game was translated by Nintendo Treehouse, who also headed the localization for Sacred Stones, Path of Radiance, Radiant Dawn, and Fates. The team has had the job of not only translating, but also making Fire Emblem more fit for overseas audience. Such examples of this include changing dialogue, aging up characters, and minor adjustments to gameplay. Blazing Blade was definitely a big milestone for the Fire Emblem franchise, as it was the best game to use to introduce to a Western audience. If we hadn't gotten Blazing Blade, we may have not been playing great games like Shadows of Valentia today. I'd highly recommend playing Blazing Blade. If you have a Wii U, you can pick it up on the eShop, and if you're up for it, you can get a good old-fashioned cartridge. And if you really want, you can download an emulator. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. My name is Jay, and this is a little series that I hope to do because I love Fire Emblem, and I love finding and sharing information about it. Let me know if you guys want to see more. Thank you!